Hey there, welcome to Sleepy History Secrets, the channel where history gets weirder the quieter you listen. Tonight, we're stepping into an age of lace, posture and quiet suffering, the Victorian world of etiquette. A time when a woman could ruin her reputation with a sneeze or send a marriage proposal by the angle of her fan. Where everything, from your breath to your silence, had a rule book. And those rules, though wrapped in ribbons and politeness, were a kind of invisible architecture, shaping what women could say, feel, or even think. Before we begin, please take a slow breath. Let the weight of the day soften a little. Maybe dim the lights, or let the hum of your room settle into the background. If you'd like, tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. It's strangely comforting to imagine how many of us are awake at the wrong hour, each in our own small corner of the world sharing this same quiet curiosity. And now, as the city outside sinks into sleep, we turn back to an era when being ladylike was considered both an art form and a survival strategy. Let's drift gently into the world of the Victorians, a place where behaviour was architecture, silence was language, and every move was part of the performance. Imagine waking up in a world where every hour of your life has a stage direction. You rise from bed not simply to start the day, but to begin the daily production of yourself. The curtains open on your bedroom, the soft light filters through lace, and you are both the actor and the audience, performing grace before an invisible crowd. Victorian Britain treated politeness as proof of morality. A woman didn't just behave well, she embodied virtue, like a living sermon wrapped in silk. To sit correctly, to smile softly, to speak modestly, these were not gestures, they were credentials. The manual said so. Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, The Habits of Good Society, the Lady's Book of Etiquette, each one a script for staying respectable and therefore safe. You didn't read them for fun, you read them to survive. Homes themselves became theatres of morality. The drawing room was the main stage, its furniture arranged for maximum observation. Couches faced each other just closely enough to make escape awkward. Even a fainting couch, that delicate piece of furniture now seen as feminine fragility, served a deeper purpose. It was a prop for emotional control. If you felt overwhelmed, you didn't collapse. You reclined gracefully in a manner appropriate for fainting. The architecture of etiquette went further still. Doors opened inward so servants could enter silently, like stagehands. Carpets softened footsteps. Curtains filtered both light and visibility, because too much sunlight was considered vulgar, and too much attention was dangerous. The home wasn't simply where you lived. It was a moral apparatus that shaped how you were seen. Every gesture carried a weight it didn't deserve. Holding a teacup too tightly meant nervousness. Laughing too loudly meant vanity. Resting your arm too casually meant boredom, and boredom itself was nearly a crime. To be idle was to tempt sin, yet to appear busy with the wrong things was equally suspect. So women developed the fine art of refined motion, graceful, deliberate, but never hurried. Like a dancer who must never admit she's performing. There were no mirrors large enough to reflect how exhausting this was. In polite society, your reputation preceded you like perfume, invisible but overwhelming. Even neighbours and friends acted as critics, keeping score of how long you visited, what you wore, and whether your handshake lingered a fraction too long. You could be ruined by posture alone. And the irony, all this restraint was sold as freedom. Manuals promised that good manners elevated a woman, that by controlling her body she mastered her destiny. But in practice it was the opposite. The more polished the manners, the tighter the leash. The polite woman was admired precisely because she disappeared. To keep order, Victorians blurred the line between morality and aesthetics. Beauty became a branch of ethics. Smooth fabric meant inner calm. Pale skin meant spiritual purity. Silence meant wisdom. The The result was a culture that prized the illusion of serenity over the experience of happiness. You could suffer, fainting from a corset, suffocating under lace, as long as you did it gracefully. The home wasn't the only theatre. The street was an extension of the stage. To step outside was to risk review by the public eye. Women were told to glide, not walk, as if the earth itself might find their footsteps presumptuous. Gliding required control, knees together, gaze lowered, breath small, a choreography of modesty. Yet it was also a form of unspoken rebellion. Many women learned to express themselves in tiny, almost invisible gestures: the tilt of a chin, the turn of a parasol, the daring use of colour beneath a cloak. Each was a whisper of defiance inside the grand performance of obedience. Servants too understood this theatre. They watched silently from the wings, managing props, adjusting lighting, maintaining the illusion of ease. A lady's reputation depended on their discretion. They knew who truly fainted, who merely pretended, and who occasionally swore when no one was listening. The unspoken pact of the household was simple. Everyone was acting, and everyone knew it. Even conversation followed a script. Certain topics, politics, medicine, ambition, were considered unsuitable for female mouths. Instead, women became masters of subtext. A comment about the weather could imply rebellion. A compliment on drapery could mean disdain. When silence is mandatory, language finds creative loopholes. And perhaps that's the strangest truth of all. Within this suffocating politeness, women invented a secret art: the ability to speak without saying, to move without leaving, to express power within stillness. Their restraint became a kind of performance art, invisible to those who demanded it, but perfectly understood by those forced to live it. As the candlelight flickers over a parlour thick with rules, you realise that the theatre of decorum wasn't only a Victorian invention. The same choreography survives today, in office small talk, in social media smiles, in the constant awareness of being watched. The costumes have changed, but the performance continues. If we follow that thread a little further, it leads us to the body itself, to the corsets, the breath, and the strange idea that virtue could be measured in inches of the waist. You take a breath, or at least you try to. It doesn't go far. The air moves down your throat, meets resistance, and politely stops halfway, as if unsure whether it's allowed inside. That hesitation is not weakness, it's etiquette. Because in the Victorian world, even breathing came with rules. The corset was not just an accessory, it was a philosophy, stitched in whalebone and ribbon. It shaped more than waists, it sculpted behaviour. To be cinched was to be respectable. To breathe freely was to risk indecency. A loose garment suggested a loose mind. So each morning began with a ritual of compression. You stood still as another pair of hands, often a maid's, pulled the laces tighter, inch by inch, until your ribs obeyed. Every tug redefined your outline, and every gasp became part of the soundtrack of civilization. They called it posture training. Doctors and dressmakers agreed that a straight spine meant a straight character. Slouching was not merely bad for the back, it was bad for the soul. Medical journals warned that unstructured breathing encouraged laziness, daydreams, even moral drift. A woman who breathed too easily might think too easily too. So science lent its voice to fashion, and the corset became both a cage and a crown, a burden disguised as elegance. The language of air was moral poetry. Breathing was grace, measured not by volume but by poise. The ideal woman floated through her day in slow, shallow inhales, her voice soft as a sigh, her laughter brief, her movements deliberate. She was meant to look as if she'd never run, never shouted, never exhaled too hard on anyone. Her lungs, after all, were a private matter. Corset makers understood the psychology. They sold restraint as empowerment. Advertisements promised health through control. A properly fitted corset, one claimed, supports the figure and the morals. Ladies' magazines featured engravings of models smiling faintly as they were laced, their cheeks pale, their waists the size of a gentleman's hat. Breath was optional. Beauty was compulsory. The body learned to adapt. Internal organs adjusted their positions, like tenants in a shrinking house. Ribs folded inward, stomachs migrated upward, hearts learned to beat within tighter borders, and yet the fashion persisted for decades because the discomfort felt meaningful. It wasn't just pain, it was proof of discipline. Women said it improved posture, complexion, and even confidence. Some believed it made breathing more elegant, which was technically true. It limited both the breath and the noise. Still, there were cracks in the illusion. Fainting became epidemic. Drawing rooms filled with women reclining on fainting couches, each one a monument to stylish collapse. Doctors called it female weakness. Women called it Tuesday. Every household owned smelling salts, a kind of olfactory defibrillator that revived the unconscious long enough for them to resume pretending they were fine. Not everyone obeyed the script. The dress reform movement argued that oxygen was not a moral failing. Rational dress societies sprouted in London and New York, preaching that lungs were not luxuries. But reformers were mocked as eccentric, unfeminine, even dangerous. A woman who could bend at the waist or climb stairs without supervision was clearly a threat to civilization. Behind the laughter, though, something radical was forming, an awareness of how deeply the body could be trained to lie. A corset didn't just hide the body, it taught the mind to believe that discomfort was refinement, that the ache was elegance, that the weight on your ribs meant you were still part of the performance. At balls and dinners, conversation glided politely around the subject. No one discussed breath. It was impolite to mention what everyone lacked. Women developed tiny strategies of survival, leaning subtly against furniture, hiding brief exhales behind lace fans, laughing without moving their torsos. The human body, endlessly inventive, learned to fake stillness while fighting for air. By night, unlacing became its own ceremony. The first deep breath after hours of constriction was almost spiritual. The lungs expanded with sound, that quiet, shuddering relief of air rediscovering space. It was the most honest sigh of the day, and perhaps the most private moment a woman could have. Freedom was measured not in rights or money, but in inches of ribbon loosened before bed. The faint scent of perfume lingered, lavender, rosewater, something gentle enough not to offend, but strong enough to remind her she still existed beneath the fabric. She hung the corset neatly by her bedside, its curves holding the ghost of her own body. Tomorrow she would lace herself back into virtue, and no one would call it strange. And of course the logic never vanished. It merely changed shape. The corset evolved into modern shapewear, elastic, invisible, promising confidence instead of morality. Breath remains negotiable. Posture remains profitable. We may not lace ourselves into bone and whalebone anymore, but we still inhale, carefully for photographs, hold in our stomachs for mirrors, and exhale only when no one's watching. So when you see those portraits of Victorian women, serene, narrow, impossibly composed, remember that they were experts in the delicate art of controlled survival. Their stillness was an act of endurance, their elegance, a quiet rebellion against collapse, and their faint smiles, the most sophisticated form of irony ever recorded. As we drift further into the story, you start to notice something else. How even the simple act of walking became a moral performance, where movement itself required permission. To walk, for most people, is a simple thing, a movement of bones and balance, the body's quiet declaration of independence. But in Victorian Britain, walking wasn't just transportation. It was performance, politics, and sometimes a minor act of rebellion. Every step you took was watched, judged, and decoded. You didn't walk through the world. You glided through scrutiny. The era was obsessed with modesty, and nowhere did modesty reach such absurd precision as in the rules of female movement. Women were taught to walk gracefully, which meant in practice to barely move at all. Steps were to be small, deliberate, and soundless, as though the earth itself might disapprove of being touched. The goal was not arrival, but appearance. You were to float, a spiritual being disguised as a pedestrian. Of course, floating is difficult when you're dragging 10 pounds of layered fabric, a petticoat, and several underskirts that act like parachutes catching the wind. Add in the corset's tight grip on your ribs, and breathing while walking becomes a logistical problem. But grace demanded effort, and effort was to be invisible. The perfect lady never appeared out of breath, even when climbing a hill, fleeing rain, or surviving yet another polite disaster called a garden party. Ankles were the era's great scandal. For reasons still known only to history's more imaginative moralists, the lower leg was considered dangerously suggestive. A glimpse of an ankle could send gossip rippling faster than an affair. Newspapers printed stories of accidental immodesty when a carriage overturned or a skirt caught the wind. Artists painted ankles like secrets, wrapped in shadow and implication. And so, women were taught to walk in ways that prevented revelation. They mastered the shuffle, the sidestep, the dignified hover. Even tripping was to be done tastefully. Long skirts became portable prisons. They swept through dust, mud, and horse droppings, collecting the city as they went. On rainy days, fabric absorbed water until it weighed nearly as much as a child. Yet lifting the hem too high was unthinkable. Better to risk pneumonia than indecency. Fires were another hazard. Crinolines, those wide, cage-like petticoats of steel and whalebone, could catch a spark from a fireplace or candle and turn elegance into a blaze within seconds. Fashion journals offered advice not on how to prevent such accidents, but on how to perish gracefully. Shoes were another story. Delicate, embroidered, utterly impractical. They were made for show, not for streets. Cobbled roads were rough and filthy. So many women wore overshoes called pattens, metal frames that lifted the foot a few inches above the ground. They clinked and scraped as you walked, announcing your presence like reluctant bells. Still, a lady's true shoes, the ones of silk and ribbon, were hidden beneath the skirt. They were a private luxury, glimpsed by no one, proof of refinement kept secret even from admiration. Some women took the absurdity and turned it to power. They used the same choreography meant to restrict them to command attention instead. The slow turn of a head, the deliberate pause before stepping into a room, these became tools of social control. A woman could make every man in the room stop speaking simply by adjusting her pace. In a world where words were limited, silence could be deafening. Etiquette books were relentless on the subject. The habits of good society advised women never to rush lest they appear common. Running was practically treason. One manual warned that a lady seen to hurry loses half her dignity in the eyes of the world. Half. It didn't say which half, though presumably the lower one. If you were late, you were to arrive serenely, pretending time itself had waited for you out of respect. And yet, women still walked. They had to visit, to shop, to breathe the faint illusion of freedom. Parks and promenades became carefully designed stages for this ritual. Wide paths, clean gravel, shaded benches, all created not for exercise, but for display. The act of walking became a kind of social currency. Couples met eyes, exchanged glances, communicated entire novels without a single word. It was the Victorian version of scrolling. You looked, you judged, you imagined. Of course, not everyone could afford to float. Working women moved differently. Servants walked quickly because they had to. Factory girls hurried through streets in muddy boots carrying the dust of their labour home. They were scolded for unfeminine haste, but speed was survival. The same society that admired stillness in rich women punished motion in poor ones. The moral geometry of walking was clear. Grace was a privilege. By the end of the century, reformers began to notice that women who walked more and faster also thought more freely. Dress reform again appeared, this time championing shorter skirts and lighter fabrics. The press ridiculed them, of course. Bloomerism, they called it, as if sensible clothing were an illness. But women who adopted it discovered something radical. When you could walk without tripping, you could also leave. And that was the quiet fear behind all these rules, that walking led to movement of the mind. To walk alone was to choose your own direction, a small taste of autonomy that no corset or curtain could contain. So, as you picture a Victorian street, the sound of hooves, the rattle of carriages, the rustle of skirts brushing the pavement, notice the women moving through it like ghosts, their steps muted but their defiance alive beneath every fold of fabric. They weren't just walking. They were negotiating with gravity and morality at once, trying to stay upright in a world determined to keep them ornamental. And still, the choreography continues. Today's heels echo on office floors, balancing confidence with pain. The glide remains, now performed under fluorescent light instead of gas lamps. The shoes have changed, but the posture of restraint endures. If we follow the faint sound of those footsteps a little further, they lead us back indoors, to a room heavy with perfume, fainting couches, and the delicate art of collapsing without scandal. You stand in a crowded drawing room, the air thick with perfume and expectation. Conversation hums like low music. The corset presses, the layers of fabric trap heat, and somewhere behind you, a piano begins a polite waltz. It's all very civilized, except for the small matter that you can no longer feel your ribs. Then, quite gracefully, you stop pretending. Your knees unlock, your head tilts back just enough, and the world dissolves into a blur of astonished faces. You have fainted, correctly, fashionably, and on time. Victorian fainting wasn't just biology, it was choreography. Women perfected it the way dancers practice turns. There were social rules for collapsing. Never too suddenly, never face first, and certainly never in the street unless you were seeking employment as a moral lesson. The feint had to occur indoors, near a fainting couch, a long curved seat that waited patiently for its purpose. The fainting couch was to the Victorian home what the smartphone is today, always within reach, always ready to absorb another emotional overload. Doctors wrote endlessly about this epidemic of fragility. They debated its cause: nerves, hysteria, tight lacing, the lunar cycle, the position of Venus. One physician solemnly claimed women fainted because their delicate sensibilities could not bear the shock of too much oxygen. Another argued that sudden excitement, such as hearing one's name unexpectedly, could trigger collapse. Apparently, consciousness itself was a medical risk. In truth, many women fainted strategically. The swoon was a graceful loophole in a world that punished direct refusal. You couldn't argue with your father about marriage, but you could faint at the dinner table. You couldn't object to an unwanted suitor, but you could collapse dramatically when he entered the room. The feint was both surrender and rebellion, the only socially approved way to say no without speaking. It was resistance written in falling cursive. Entire industries bloomed around this art. Smelling salts, small crystal vials filled with ammonia, were sold in decorative silver cases, sometimes shaped like hearts. Perfume houses marketed restorative essences, promising revival with a single sniff. Upholstery designers advertised fainting couches as medically beneficial. The world built furniture and fragrance around the expectation that women would occasionally lose consciousness for aesthetic reasons. Of course, fainting had a hierarchy. A soft, seated faint was elegant. A dramatic one was vulgar. The respectable swoon involved no flailing, no sound, and ideally no disruption to the furniture. The goal was to look less like a medical emergency and more like a wilted flower. Many women practiced it privately, learning how to fall in stages, head, shoulder, then torso, as if melting gently into morality. But beneath the humour was exhaustion. The feint was an admission that the performance of politeness had limits. When conversation, corsetry and conformity pressed too tightly, the body did what words could not. It stopped participating. Each swoon was a brief holiday from control, a few seconds when silence could not be interpreted, when propriety had to wait. Writers of the time romanticised it. Novels described heroines fainting in moonlight or collapsing from too much virtue. Artists painted women draped over furniture, glowing with spiritual delicacy. Yet, in real life, fainting was often messy. The floor was cold, the corset stayed tight, and someone had to revive you with a substance that smelled like lightning. Still, society preferred the myth to the reality. It was easier to admire weakness than to address why strength was forbidden. Not everyone fainted willingly. Some resisted entirely, priding themselves on their constitution. To remain upright became a quiet badge of rebellion. Among suffragists and reformers, fainting was ridiculed as the emblem of obedience. They mocked it in pamphlets and plays, declaring that true equality required staying conscious. But most women lived in between, neither rebels nor fainting icons, just tired participants in a system that confused silence with virtue. At its core, the swoon was about attention. In a culture that denied women direct voice, fainting guaranteed a moment of focus. For a few seconds, you became the centre of the room. People stopped talking, servants hurried, and the social order paused. It was power disguised as helplessness. When you awoke, pale and trembling, you could feign confusion, or gratitude, or mild surprise that anyone had noticed. And yet, you had been noticed. There's a quiet genius in that, turning vulnerability into stagecraft. A woman who fainted controlled the narrative. She redirected tension, diffused arguments, delayed decisions. The feint became emotional punctuation in a language of constraint. In some ways, it was the only sentence society allowed women to finish. Even the sound of fainting was part of the design. The hush that followed, that sudden sacred silence, was the only true peace many Victorian women ever experienced. No criticism, no instruction, no chatter about manners or morality. Just a brief, suspended stillness where everything waited for permission to resume. If you listen closely, you can almost hear it. The thud of a fainting couch, the collective gasp, the whisper of skirts settling against carpet. Then, the sharp scent of ammonia cutting through the room, the rustle of revived modesty. A woman opens her eyes, sees that everyone has returned to their places, and smiles faintly. The play continues, and though the feint has vanished from our drawing rooms, its logic lingers. Today we may not collapse onto velvet cushions, but we still have our modern versions of retreat. The carefully timed disappearance, the polite burnout, the digital "I'm fine." We still manage exhaustion as if it were etiquette. The fainting couch has been replaced by the quiet glow of a phone screen, where we scroll through curated calm while holding our breath. So yes, the feint was absurd, but it was also brilliant. Within its theatrics lay a soft kind of defiance, proof that even the most restricted body could find a moment of escape. It wasn't strength or weakness, it was survival with style. As the last traces of perfume fade from that stifled parlour, our quiet exploration now turns toward another language of restraint. The world of coded gestures, fluttering fans, and gloved hands that spoke entire paragraphs without a single sound. Picture a ballroom. Light glitters across chandeliers like frozen laughter, the air warm with perfume and wax. Dresses whisper against one another, the faint scrape of shoes marks the rhythm, and somewhere above the hum of polite conversation comes a soft flutter, the sound of a folding fan opening like a secret. In the Victorian world, silence was never empty. It was encoded. The fan was far more than a tool for cooling oneself. It was a dictionary written in fabric and gesture, a way to speak when words were forbidden. Manuals appeared promising to teach this new language, how to hold, flick, close or hide behind a fan to convey everything from flirtation to despair. A slow wave could mean follow me. A sharp snap might say, not tonight. Dropping it to the floor could signal either disaster or interest depending on which book you read. The meanings often contradicted one another, which made them even more thrilling. If you were misunderstood, you could always claim it was fashion, not rebellion. Every fan had a personality. There were lace ones for drawing rooms, paper ones for summer promenades, ivory and mother-of-pearl fans for balls, each fluttering its own dialect. The rustle of air through feathers was the heartbeat of the social season. Men imagined mystery in every motion. Women, meanwhile, learned to control entire conversations with the subtlest breeze. A single flick of the wrist could summon or dismiss attention without ever breaking the rule of silence. Of course, not everyone needed a fan to hide behind. Gloves served as their own code. Moral armour stitched in kid leather. To be bare-handed was a statement. To remove a glove at the wrong time was nearly indecent. Etiquette dictated that gloves must stay on for greetings, for dancing, even for eating delicate foods. They protected both skin and reputation. Touch, after all, was currency. A handshake lasted a heartbeat too long and rumour began its work. Gloves kept that danger contained. The absurdity of the rule never seemed to bother anyone. Women wore gloves that fit so tightly they required button hooks to fasten. They powdered their hands first so the leather wouldn't cling. By mid-evening, the seams cut faint lines into their wrists, gentle reminders of moral discipline. A lady's fingers were not to be instruments of desire or work. They were ornamental punctuation marks in the sentence of her body. Dropping a glove was a small disaster. A man might rush to retrieve it, an interaction already thick with implication. Should she thank him or pretend not to notice? Either way, the moment crackled with danger disguised as manners. In novels, love often began with a lost glove. In real life, it began with shared boredom. The rules were too intricate not to provoke rebellion. These props, the fan and the glove, were more than accessories. They were tools of translation, letting women speak inside a system that wanted them silent. The fan fluttered between obedience and mischief. The glove turned forbidden contact into ritual. Through them, conversation became choreography. A crowded ballroom could look serene while hundreds of small negotiations unfolded beneath the chandeliers. The historian in you might wonder whether the language of fans truly existed, or was simply invented later by romantics, nostalgic for meaning. The truth lies somewhere in between. The Victorians adored systems, flower codes, colour symbolism, gestures catalogued like butterflies. Even if no one agreed on the vocabulary, they all agreed that there should be one. And in that collective fantasy, women found agency. The pretense of secret language gave them cover to express themselves, or to hide that they were doing so. Think of it as an early version of encrypted messaging. Except instead of coded text, you had lace, feathers, and practiced poise. One woman in a crowd might raise her fan to a temple and feel a rush of power, a small invisible declaration of choice. The men saw mystery, she felt control. There was, too, a quiet sensuality in these gestures. When speech is restrained, movement becomes music. The flicker of fingers, the brush of fabric against skin, the whisper of air, all invited attention precisely because they seemed accidental. Etiquette had turned repression into theatre, and women, as always, learned to perform the lead roles. By late evening, the fans grew heavy, the gloves damp from the heat of the room. The illusion of effortlessness required effort. But even then, as the musicians played their final waltz, women still maintained the rhythm, closing fans softly like punctuation marks, gliding across the floor without breaking character. It's easy to laugh at it now, this elaborate ballet of feathers and leather, yet its echoes remain. We still send meaning through silence, the unread message, the delayed reply, the glance at a phone that says everything and nothing. Politeness has simply moved platforms. The lace fan has become the notification symbol, the glove, the invisible barrier of the screen. The old fear of touching too soon has turned into the new anxiety of typing too fast. In both worlds, decorum survives through distance. The Victorians built theirs from fabric. We build ours from pixels. But the intention is the same, to say just enough, never too much, and to leave desire suspended in polite air. If you close your eyes, you can almost hear that faint rustle again, the sigh of silk unfolding, the soft creak of leather, the heartbeat of restraint disguised as charm. And if we follow that sound a little further, it carries us toward a quieter form of conversation, the world of letters, where ink replaced gesture and where entire romances were hidden between the lines of polite handwriting. The letter arrives folded 3 times, sealed with a touch of wax and smelling faintly of rosewater. Before you even break the seal, you already know the message is not what it seems. In Victorian society, paper carried more secrets than most hearts could handle. Every letter was a small act of courage, or a very polite crime. Communication, for women especially, was a performance of subtlety. Words could not be direct. Desire could not be written plainly. A letter had to express devotion while pretending it was only friendship, and it had to be emotional while pretending it wasn't. It was a literary high-wire act performed over a sea of judgment. The postman, poor man, was both messenger and witness. He knew too much. He delivered confession after confession sealed in wax, sometimes even returned the same letters twice, one to be read, one to be destroyed. Postboxes were designed with narrow slots to discourage bulky secrets, yet women managed to fold entire emotional landscapes into small envelopes. Paper was soft, but it carried the weight of rebellion. Many women wrote using quotation. Instead of saying, "I miss you," they would borrow lines from poetry or tuck a fragment of Shakespeare between pleasantries. The right verse could ignite a conversation without lighting any visible flames. A phrase like, "My thoughts are all in another room," was enough to make a suitor dizzy for days. Quotation was camouflage, passion disguised as literacy. There were other tricks. Some women wrote with lemon juice so that the true message appeared only when warmed by candlelight. Others used invisible codes based on the arrangement of words on the page. Even the choice of stationery mattered. Blue paper for friendship, cream for admiration, ivory for something unspoken. A single pressed flower inside the fold could hold more meaning than a paragraph. Victorian ink was temperamental. It smudged easily, especially when written under candlelight. Some letters carried faint fingerprints, like ghosts of hesitation. The blot of a pen could reveal trembling hands, or tears not quite wiped away. Recipients learned to read between and around the words. The spacing, the rhythm, the faint indentation left by pressure. Emotion leaked through the page whether it was invited or not. Every letter was also a risk. Families sometimes intercepted mail, believing it their duty to protect a woman's virtue from her own handwriting. Servants were ordered to deliver and report. Privacy, that modern miracle, barely existed. Yet women wrote anyway, trusting paper more than people. The quiet scratch of a pen became a sound of freedom. Not all letters were about love. Many were acts of negotiation. A woman might write to a friend to request an introduction, to a dressmaker about a delayed gown, or to a society matron to apologise for existing too boldly at last Thursday's dinner. Each had its own formula, not the mathematical kind, but a ritual pattern of flattery and distance. "I beg to remain your most humble admirer" was not humility, it was insurance. There were also letters that never left the desk. The unsent draft, folded, tied with ribbon, hidden in drawers, was its own genre. Women wrote to lovers they could not marry, to children they could not protect, to themselves when no one else would listen. The act of writing became a mirror, one where honesty could finally breathe. Paper didn't interrupt or correct grammar, it simply received. For those who lived within etiquette's narrow corridors, letters provided the only real doorway to self. They could travel further than bodies were allowed. A message sent from London to Bath might cross class lines, reputations, entire worlds. Ink was democratic in a way society was not. A woman could write in the same language as a queen and be taken seriously, until the envelope was opened. The postal service tried to keep up. By the mid-19th century, stamps made correspondence affordable for the first time. Suddenly, the world buzzed with paper. Lovers, friends, and quiet revolutionaries filled the air with their confessions. Historians later called it the age of the letter. They could just as easily have called it the age of people finally saying what they meant. Even the physical act of writing carried elegance. Stationery was thick, smooth, and faintly scented. The pen, a delicate nib dipped in ink, forced you to slow down, to consider every word. There was no delete, key, no backspace, no instant regret. You wrote in real time with the rhythm of your heartbeat. Mistakes were not erased but folded into the story, and then came the waiting, the longest part. Days passed. Horses carried your heart across muddy roads. The reply could arrive weeks later or not at all. The silence between letters became its own language, one of hope, dread, or graceful acceptance. When a reply finally did appear, your fingers trembled as you slid the blade beneath the seal. For a few seconds, as the wax cracked and the scent of paper filled the air, you were both terrified and alive. If the message was kind, the room brightened. If it wasn't, the letterbox became an accomplice to heartbreak. Yet even then, the object itself remained beautiful. Many women kept their letters in decorative boxes, tied with ribbons like small funerals for their emotions. They never threw them away, not because they couldn't move on, but because those letters were proof that they had once been heard. And so the culture of silence developed its most poetic contradiction. The era that forbade women to speak freely produced some of history's most articulate love letters. When you cannot speak, you learn to write beautifully. The last letters of the Victorian century still exist, fragile and fading. You can see the ink trembling at the edges, the curves of words that once held an entire world of restraint and longing. They remind us that communication doesn't need volume, only courage and quiet persistence. As the candle burns low beside that small mountain of paper, you can almost hear the scratch of a pen echoing through time. The conversation has only just begun, and if we follow its faint perfume a little further, it leads to a new kind of silence, one made not of words but of scent and sound, where even laughter had to be measured like perfume poured from a bottle. Imagine opening a door and being greeted not by a person, but by a smell. That was how most introductions worked in Victorian Britain. Perfume didn't just decorate you, it introduced you. It carried your reputation into a room before your voice could. And if the scent lingered too long after you left, it said something about you, something daring, or scandalous, or worse, foreign. The Victorian nose was a moral instrument. Too much fragrance meant you were trying to disguise something. Too little meant you had nothing to hide but also nothing to offer. Respectability lived somewhere between faint lavender and near invisibility. Perfume had to be polite, like conversation that never raised its voice. A lady's scent was a social decision. Manuals recommended soft floral tones to complement humility. Jasmine, rose or violet were acceptable. Musk was considered dangerous. Sandalwood was practically an invitation to gossip. Women were told to perfume only their handkerchiefs, never their skin. To carry scent on the body was to suggest warmth, and warmth, of course, hinted at emotion. Nothing was feared more than emotion that others could detect. The air of a Victorian gathering was a battlefield of aromas: furniture polish, wax candles, tobacco, sweat disguised by cologne. Against this orchestra of smells, women fought for balance. Perfume became both shield and confession. Even soap carried meaning. The wealthy used imported glycerin soaps in delicate shapes, while the poor relied on harsh carbolic bars that smelled faintly of medicine. Cleanliness, once a matter of health, became a performance of class. Sound, too, was carefully regulated. Silence wasn't the absence of noise, it was an achievement. Laughter, for example, had rules. A lady could smile with sound, but only briefly. To laugh freely was to surrender control, and control was the highest virtue. Etiquette books warned against shrill amusement, the auditory equivalent of moral collapse. Women learned to master the art of the restrained laugh, a soft exhale through the nose, the kind that sounded like agreement but felt like suffocation. The dinner table was the main theatre of restraint. Silverware moved in quiet rhythm, conversation circled harmlessly around the weather, and the only thing louder than politeness was hunger. Even chewing had a code. One etiquette manual instructed women to eat as though uncertain the food is edible. A perfect summary of Victorian morality: consume life carefully and apologise while doing it. There were those who rebelled through sound. Loud women were considered ungovernable. Suffragists, for example, were mocked for their unfeminine voices. Newspapers described their public speeches as shocking to the ear. Yet every raised voice was a kind of liberation, a refusal to keep beauty bottled in silence. Perfume and laughter were both small freedoms that had to be rationed. A whiff too bold, a chuckle too loud, and you risked being labelled fast, a word that didn't mean quick but morally slippery. It was the century's favourite insult, useful for anyone who seemed too alive. Behind closed doors, of course, the rules softened. Private laughter had a different tone. Women giggled with friends over tea, or laughed silently into their sleeves when the men left the room. Perfume, too, grew stronger in private. Diaries mention the satisfaction of applying scent as one pleases, for no audience but oneself. It was a quiet rebellion, a way of reclaiming the senses from the endless supervision of others. Perfume also told stories of empire. The ingredients that filled those crystal bottles came from far away. Sandalwood from India, cinnamon from Ceylon, vanilla from the Caribbean. The British Empire smelled like power and contradiction. Imported sensuality bottled for domestic restraint. Women wore the world on their wrists without ever being allowed to travel. A drop of exotic oil was permitted as long as it stayed polite, and yet, despite the constraints, scent gave life a strange intimacy. Letters were perfumed so the smell lingered in the air long after the ink dried. Lovers could recognise each other by fragrance alone. A widow might keep a husband's handkerchief tucked in a drawer, his cologne slowly fading, time measured not by clocks but by scent. Memory itself became aromatic. The Victorians even believed smell carried moral lessons. Odour was linked to virtue. Sweet-smelling people were assumed to have pure souls. Cities smelled of class, the poor with coal smoke and work, the rich with powder and flowers. It was an unspoken caste system of the air. Reformers spoke of cleansing neighbourhoods, meaning both sanitation and morality. Cleanliness was not just next to godliness, it was proof of it. Of course, the irony was everywhere. Underneath the cologne and roses, London reeked of sewage. The Thames was so foul they called it the Great Stink. Yet inside parlours, people debated the ethics of scent while holding handkerchiefs to their noses. The empire could control everything, except its own odour. So the Victorians learned to manage contradiction. They turned their senses into instruments of etiquette. Smell became self-control, silence became sophistication, and laughter became rationed pleasure. Each rule designed to make people easier to bear and less alive to themselves. Still, beneath the lavender water and the careful hush, life had its leaks. A real laugh would sometimes escape at the wrong moment, a bright human sound that cut through the room like a spark. And for a heartbeat, everyone remembered what freedom actually felt like. That was the danger and the beauty of being alive in a century obsessed with restraint. Even within its silence, the human voice kept finding ways to echo. As the last notes of laughter fade and the perfume settles into still air, the story leads us gently into another kind of silence, not made by people, but by the spaces around them, the rooms, the doors, the furniture itself, all quietly designed to teach people how to behave. If you were a Victorian woman, the walls around you didn't just shelter you, they instructed you. Every hallway, every piece of furniture, every curtain had an opinion about how you should behave. Houses were not built only to keep weather out, they were built to keep propriety in. The architecture itself was a teacher, whispering the language of obedience through its doors, its symmetry, and its careful boundaries. Step inside a proper middle-class home and the first thing you'll notice is division. Public rooms near the entrance were bright, tidy, and meant to impress. Private ones at the back were dim, cluttered, and invisible. There was a room for visiting, a room for music, a room for sewing, even a room for fainting. Every emotion categorised and filed away in plaster and wallpaper. The Victorians loved moral geometry. Straight lines meant order. Curves meant temptation. And so, the walls stood firm and moral, separating thought from action and action from pleasure. The drawing room was the moral stage. Visitors entered, removed their gloves, and sat according to invisible choreography. Ladies occupied chairs near the window for light, never on the floor unless they wanted to start rumours about their upbringing. Men stood until invited to sit, though only on furniture that matched their class. A misplaced chair could trigger subtle panic. Etiquette dictated everything down to the distance between chairs, close enough for conversation, but never so close that knees might recognise each other's existence. Even furniture spoke. The famous fainting couch, positioned elegantly near the hearth, symbolised both fragility and control. Its sloping arm invited repose but not sleep. It was made for temporary collapse, not comfort. Tables were kept small so that meals could be served in courses by servants moving like shadows. Windows were draped heavily, filtering sunlight into the proper moral temperature, bright enough for respectability, dim enough to discourage enthusiasm. Stairs played their part too, narrow and steep in servants' quarters, broad and ceremonial in the main hall. Servants were expected to move unseen, their footsteps muffled by layers of carpet. Silence was not just virtue, it was architecture. The upper floors belonged to women, delicate spaces perfumed and embroidered, while the lower belonged to men, heavy with wood and tobacco. Even light followed gender. Ladies' rooms glowed softly with pastel shades. Studies were dim and serious, suitable for thinking. Walking through a house was like travelling through social hierarchy. Every threshold marked a change in behaviour. At the front door you became a guest. In the parlour, a spectacle. In the dining room, a participant in ritual. Bedrooms were sanctuaries where even mirrors behaved differently, tilted high enough to flatter, low enough to remind. Privacy, as we understand it, barely existed. Curtains were drawn not for secrecy but for shadow. Modesty required dimness. And then there were the corridors, those long echoing passages connecting everything yet meaning nothing. They were the arteries of propriety, designed for quiet passage, not conversation. You could glide through a Victorian hallway without leaving evidence you had lived at all. The walls absorbed footsteps, whispers, and sometimes entire lives. The architecture extended beyond the home. Public buildings mirrored private morality. Churches, schools, and theatres all arranged people in visible order. Men and women seated apart, the wealthy above, the poor below. Streets too were moral maps. Respectable women avoided certain corners, certain hours, certain gazes. The city became an enormous house with invisible rooms, places where you could and could not exist. Even gardens had etiquette. Pathways curved for modest, strolling. Benches were placed at polite intervals to prevent intimacy. Nature itself was landscaped into obedience. The idea was simple. If people moved correctly, they would think correctly. The Victorians believed virtue could be built like architecture, brick by brick, habit by habit, until the very air carried instructions. Servants understood the code best. They knew which rooms to enter sideways, which stairs to use, when to appear and disappear. Their invisibility was part of the design. The house functioned as a quiet machine powered by human silence. The upper classes called it harmony. The servants called it Tuesday. For women, this architecture was both prison and refuge. Inside its walls, they were protected from scandal, yet also contained by it. A lady could rule her drawing room like a queen, as long as she never left it. Domestic space became the acceptable kingdom of female influence. Control over decor, dinner arrangements, and moral temperature replaced control over destiny. And yet, even within these carefully measured walls, rebellion found small cracks. Women decorated their rooms with personal tokens, photographs, pressed flowers, poems hidden in frames, a touch of blue in the curtains, a painting too daringly sentimental. These were whispers of individuality stitched into wallpaper. They could not change the structure, but they could change its atmosphere. The house was a cage scented with resistance. When the day ended and lamps were lit, the choreography continued. Curtains drawn, doors half closed, voices softened for evening. The glow of gaslight turned rooms golden and heavy. In that faint light, the architecture seemed to sigh, tired from a day of keeping everyone in line. The furniture stood still, dutiful as ever, waiting to resume its supervision in the morning. It's easy to think of architecture as silent, but in Victorian England, it hummed with rules. Walls reminded you to be quiet. Carpets muffled emotion. Even ceilings carried authority, their painted angels watching from above. The home taught lessons every moment: how to sit, how to move, when to smile, and when to vanish. Today, our spaces aren't so different. Open-plan offices reward visibility over privacy. Glass walls promise transparency while inviting constant scrutiny. We have simply replaced velvet drapes with screens. We still live inside invisible blueprints of behaviour, softer perhaps, but built from the same materials of observation and control. So when you imagine a Victorian house at night, quiet, dim, the faint smell of coal smoke drifting through lace curtains, remember that it wasn't just a place to live. It was a moral classroom made of wood and wallpaper, a world that taught its occupants how to behave, how to disappear, and how to dream within limits. And as the lamplight fades over that disciplined household, our story follows the sound of footsteps leading into another chamber of society, one where politeness became a business, and even virtue could be sold by the ounce. Picture a bookshop in London around the year 1865. Shelves upon shelves, stacked not with poetry or science, but with manuals. How to behave in all possible situations, hints on graceful deportment, the perfect lady at home and abroad. Each volume promises salvation through civility. For a few shillings you can purchase the illusion of being acceptable. You can buy composure in paperback. Victorian manners weren't just about behaviour, they were an economy of self-doubt. Every rule created a need, and every need created a market. Publishers, lecturers, and columnists discovered that insecurity sold better than enlightenment. Each new etiquette problem required a guide to solve it, and the more guides that appeared, the more problems they invented. A headline might ask, "Are you walking correctly?" as if motion itself could be morally graded. It was in every sense the birth of lifestyle branding. The tone of these manuals was part sermon, part threat. A lady who speaks first is never respected. A gentleman who coughs during a recital has insulted the host. Never eat asparagus with enthusiasm. The lessons read less like advice and more like minor commandments, designed not to improve life, but to sell peace of mind. Manners became a form of insurance, politeness as protection against humiliation. Lecturers toured the country teaching social refinement. Admission cost a small fortune, but attendees left clutching certificates of grace as if courtesy were a diploma. Newspapers printed weekly etiquette columns, turning politeness into serialized suspense. Readers sent in questions: may one sneeze twice? Is it vulgar to applaud? And waited anxiously for the printed verdict. The nation became a classroom, and everyone was afraid of failing. The beauty of this business model was its endless renewal. The rules kept changing, which meant you had to keep buying. Last year's politeness could become this year's scandal. The market for moral improvement thrived on exhaustion. Each purchase whispered, "You're almost perfect, but not quite." Even charity acquired a code. There were proper and improper ways to be kind. Donating too much looked vain, too little looked cruel. Invitations required exact timing. A visit sent too early was desperation. Too late was neglect. The smallest gesture could collapse into disgrace. No wonder people sought guidance. No wonder publishers smiled. Anxiety, after all, is a renewable resource. The connection between morality and marketing was deliberate. To be respectable meant to look as though you spent money wisely, enough to show refinement, but not enough to suggest pride. Shopkeepers learned this dance quickly. Perfume ads promised discretion in every drop. Tailors sold coats for the man who need never speak his worth aloud. Even household goods were sold as moral instruments. A spotless carpet was evidence of good character. Clean curtains were practically a confession of faith. Women, of course, carried the heaviest burden. Their reputations could be destroyed by a rumour about how they sat, spoke, or smiled. That fear was profitable. Dressmakers, beauty advisors, and etiquette coaches built empires on the tension between admiration and accusation. The perfect lady was always a few lessons away from disaster, and each lesson came with a price tag. For the middle class, etiquette became a kind of currency. It allowed you to purchase belonging without actually owning wealth. A well-timed curtsy could be worth more than gold. A misused fork could bankrupt your social capital. In a country obsessed with hierarchy, behaviour became the new money, cheaper than land, but just as difficult to earn. What's fascinating is how the language of these guides still echoes today. Replace lady with professional, and the advice fits neatly into modern life. Dress appropriately, speak carefully, manage your image, hide your exhaustion. The products have changed. No longer corsets and calling cards, but subscriptions and skincare. Yet the logic remains. In every era, someone finds a way to sell you the person you already are. There's a soft comedy to it. Imagine a room full of Victorians learning how to nod. A teacher demonstrates the ideal angle. Not too sharp, not too slow, precisely 5 degrees of humility. The audience takes notes, serious and breathless, terrified of nodding incorrectly. It's absurd, and yet the absurdity feels familiar. Replace the room with a modern seminar on confidence, and little has changed. By the late 19th century, even scientists joined the trend. Pseudo-medical experts claimed manners improved health. Good posture meant better digestion. Polite speech meant calmer nerves. They published charts showing how rudeness allegedly shortened life expectancy. It was politeness by pseudoscience, the moral version of a fitness routine. The real brilliance of Victorian etiquette wasn't that it taught people how to behave, it taught them how to watch themselves behave. Self-surveillance became a virtue. You didn't need a policeman when you carried one inside your conscience. The manuals didn't just tell you what to do, they told you to monitor your own thoughts, to predict criticism before it happened. You became your own judge and jailer. The profit of politeness was internalized control, and so a nation of anxious actors was born. Men bowed, women curtsied, Servants vanished like stagehands. Everyone rehearsed their roles in the great theatre of respectability. The applause came in the form of silence, the blessed relief of not being noticed for the wrong thing. Even now, echoes of that theatre remain. The influencer, the lifestyle coach, the productivity guru, all descendants of those Victorian lecturers selling grace by the hour. Are you walking correctly? Has simply become, are you living your best life? The syntax is different, the anxiety identical. Self-improvement is still a subscription service. The payment plan just uses your attention instead of coins. If you listen carefully, you can still hear the rustle of paper, the pages of old etiquette books turning like whispered advertisements. Each one murmurs the same promise: be good, and the world will love you. Be perfect, and you might even love yourself. The price, as always, is quiet exhaustion. As the lamps of the 19th century fade and the printing presses slow their churn, you can almost hear the next act begin. Somewhere in a drawing room, a silver tray gleams. On it lies a stack of crisp visiting cards, the paper currency of reputation, ready for exchange. You hear it first, the faint click of a brass knocker, the shuffle of polished boots on a tiled step. A servant opens the door just wide enough to receive an envelope-sized rectangle of heavy paper. The visitor doesn't enter. He bows, leaves the card, and departs into the drizzle. The door closes. The card travels to a silver tray in the hallway, where it will rest among others like it. Names without faces, reputations printed in elegant script. This was the Victorian social network, one card at a time. Calling cards were small, but they ruled the vast empire of manners. They carried everything a polite person needed to know: who had called, when, and how much respect they deserved in return. They were engraved, perfumed, or folded at the corners according to secret codes. A turned-down corner meant you had delivered the card in person. A folded edge meant congratulations or condolences. Sometimes a hole punched through the corner announced the visitor's arrival in town. It was friendship through origami, a quiet competition in thickness, texture, and timing. Every household owned a tray for the purpose, gleaming like an inbox polished by anxiety. Servants learned to recognize the names that mattered and the ones that didn't. A lady of ambition could spend an entire afternoon exchanging cards by carriage, stopping at each address only long enough for her footman to knock, deliver, and retreat. It was efficiency with ribbons on it. Society looked calm, but beneath that calm was war. Etiquette books referred to this process with serene cruelty. To neglect to return a card, they warned, is to declare social hostility. A missed card could end a friendship. Returning one too soon looked desperate. Too late looked insolent. Timing was strategy. Families kept small ledgers recording when they had called and when replies were due. The middle class, desperate to prove gentility, played the game with near-religious precision. Printing houses made fortunes. They offered dozens of fonts and decorative borders, doves for sentiment, ivy for loyalty, lilies for grief. Some designs glittered faintly with metallic, powder, early sparkle for the respectable. The result was a trade in personalities, morality packaged in stationery. A lady's card might read simply Mrs. Eleanor Davies, but its paper weight and scent announced far more: restraint, taste, ambition. The absurdity was not lost on anyone. Newspapers mocked the epidemic of visiting. A few brave souls protested that friendship should not require postage, but the system had logic. In a society terrified of scandal, paper allowed contact without risk. You could acknowledge someone's existence without the danger of conversation. It was emotion outsourced to stationery. Servants, the true archivists of this paper diplomacy, kept silent ledgers of their own. They knew which families were rising and which were quietly declining. A footman delivering cards to a wealthier house could feel the subtle shame of carrying paper that might not be returned. The hierarchy ran not just through people, but through envelopes. Imagine, for a moment, the sound of those cards, a light tap on metal trays, a rustle of envelopes, the hush of doors closing. It was the rhythm of reputation, as steady as a heartbeat. Entire romances began and ended through this choreography. A gentleman might send his card with a faintly penciled address. If the lady replied, it was an invitation. If she didn't, the silence spoke louder than scandal. Humour hid in the corners of the practice. One satire described a young woman who collapsed from fatigue after returning 37 visits in one day. Her manners unblemished, her health uncertain. Another joked that London traffic was caused entirely by carriages full of cards travelling nowhere. The Victorians, masters of repression, understood that absurdity was the price of order. The system also provided camouflage for the ambitious. Newly wealthy families used expensive cards to climb social ladders. A heavier card implied confidence. Gold embossing whispered of new money pretending to be old. Sometimes people forged prestige through typography. The Honourable added in ink as though titles were contagious. In the great economy of politeness, truth mattered less than paper quality. You can still feel the echo of this ritual today. Business cards handed across conference tables, digital profiles glowing on screens, social media follows offered and withdrawn, all descendants of those silent exchanges. The medium has changed, but the pulse of status remains. Each notification is a modern knock at the door, each seen message a folded corner of approval or neglect. The calling card was never just about visiting, it was about visibility. To be seen, remembered, and categorized was to exist. Without a card, you were a rumour. For women especially, cards were armour. Proof of respectability that could be displayed without speaking. A married woman's card listed her husband's name, not her own. It was a passport she did not write, a silent declaration that she belonged to someone and therefore to society. By evening, the day's spoils of paper were arranged and evaluated. Families sorted cards into piles, to be returned, to be ignored, to be remembered. Those chosen for neglect would never know why. The tray gleamed under the lamplight, a battlefield disguised as hospitality. There's something haunting in that image. Lives reduced to rectangles of ink and fibre, each promising connection, each enforcing distance. The Victorians, who feared impropriety above all else, invented a way to socialise without touching, to communicate without risk. It was genius and tragedy in equal measure. As you listen, imagine the quiet of that hallway after the last caller is gone. Only the smell of wax polish, the echo of footsteps fading, the soft weight of cards waiting for decisions. The silver tray becomes a stage for invisible dramas. Love, ambition, rejection, all printed neatly in cursive. And as we follow the flicker of lamplight across those fragile papers, the story begins to shift. Beyond the trays and printing presses lies another kind of control, not sold through books or paper, but enforced by people. The women who watched over other women, whose smiles carried warnings and whose tea parties felt suspiciously like trials. Picture a sunlit parlour, the kind filled with lace curtains and well-behaved furniture. The air smells faintly of tea and perfume, and laughter ripples gently around the room. Yet beneath that laughter hides a different sound, the quiet rhythm of judgment. Every nod, every sip, every compliment about someone's hat doubles as evidence in an invisible trial. The judges sit together, smiling sweetly over sugar cubes. Their names are Mrs. So-and-so, and their power is absolute. Victorian society adored its rules, but someone had to enforce them. Enter the matrons, older, respected women who ruled the world of manners with velvet gloves and iron expectations. They were not monarchs, but arbiters of morality. Their kingdom was the drawing room, their weapon the raised eyebrow. Gossip was not idle chatter, it was law enforcement. A young woman's reputation lived or died by what these matrons whispered over tea. They didn't need police badges. Their authority came from experience, class, and the thrilling certainty that they knew what was best. One approving word from them could open a dozen doors. One frown could close them all. They maintained social order the way gardeners trim roses, thus by cutting off what looked unruly. Etiquette manuals praised them as pillars of refinement. The truth was more complex. Many acted out of genuine care, teaching younger women how to survive a society built to criticize them. But power has a way of curdling into pleasure. Some wielded it ruthlessly. A matron might correct your posture, your speech, or the angle of your smile. Not because she disliked you, but because she needed to. Remind the room that she could. Tea parties became courtrooms. One woman's misstep provided entertainment for the rest. She spoke too loudly, someone might murmur. She stayed too long at the piano. Her dress was a shade too hopeful. Each phrase delivered softly, like lace hiding a knife. The accused, if present, learned the art of polite endurance, smiling while being quietly dismantled. It wasn't entirely cruelty. For many matrons, control was the only authority society allowed them. They couldn't vote or own property freely, but they could dictate the moral temperature of an entire neighbourhood. They became curators of decorum, preserving a fragile system that simultaneously confined and defined them. The irony was exquisite. Women, limited by rules, became the keepers of those same chains. Imagine the tension of that arrangement. A young woman at her first formal tea sits straight-backed, hands folded, eyes carefully neutral. She answers questions with modest brevity. The matrons study her like a panel of experts. Promising, one whispers. Too quiet, says another. Somewhere between those two verdicts, her future begins to tilt. Gossip served practical functions. It passed information through respectable channels when direct speech was forbidden. It regulated behaviour without ever admitting it was doing so. A rumour about another woman's poor judgment could mean anything. An unchaperoned walk, an opinion stated too confidently, a laugh too unrestrained. Gossip translated moral discomfort into entertainment. Sometimes it was a survival tactic. A matron's reputation depended on her vigilance. To spot impropriety in others was to prove one's own virtue. The logic was self-reinforcing. The more one judged, the safer one became. Friendship and surveillance blurred into one activity. "I only tell you this for her sake," was the classic prelude to a verbal execution. It might sound grim, but the scene wasn't without its comedy. There were women who learned to navigate this system with expert irony. They hosted teas knowing exactly which rumour would be born that afternoon, and they steered conversation like puppeteers. One matron famously complimented a rival's new gown by saying, "How daring! I do admire a woman who no longer fears colour." It was the 19th century version of nice outfit. I could never pull that off. Beneath the surface, it was all about power. Who had it, who didn't, and who could pretend best. Even acts of kindness carried strategic weight. Lending a dress, recommending a servant, praising a daughter's piano recital, each gesture earned social credit. The ledger of virtue was never written down, but everyone knew the score. And yet, within this tight web of control, a strange kind of solidarity sometimes emerged. When scandals threatened, matrons could protect as well as destroy. They knew how to hide mistakes, rewrite timelines, and arrange marriages, fast enough to turn impropriety into decorum. Their cruelty could be protective when turned outward, against men or the press, or a society eager to punish any woman who slipped. They were gatekeepers, yes, but sometimes they held the gate open long enough for someone to escape. The younger generation alternately feared and pitied them. Some saw them as relics of a dying code, others as survivors of it. A few dared to rebel, founding clubs and reading societies where women could speak without supervision. The matrons called these places dangerous. They were right. They were dangerous in the most necessary way. You can still feel their presence today, though their lace gloves have turned digital. The modern matron doesn't host tea, she moderates comment sections. She enforces tone, appropriateness, and brand alignment. Be kind is the new be proper. Social policing has simply moved platforms, but the psychology is identical. The desire to protect order disguised as care. The old tea tray has become the group chat, where reputations rise and fall with each screenshot. And yet, as before, the system feeds on anxiety. We're all a little bit matron now, trained to correct and to fear correction. Still, it's worth remembering that these women didn't invent repression, they managed it. In a world that left them little power, they carved control out of conversation. Every empire, even a domestic one, needs its governors. Theirs was the empire of etiquette, maintained not by soldiers, but by sentences. So the next time you imagine a Victorian parlour, the gleam of china, the polite laughter, the scent of tea, listen closely to what isn't said. The real story lies between the words, in the pauses where judgment waits to be poured like sugar. And as the last cup is emptied and the lace curtains tremble in a passing breeze, the scene begins to change. Beyond that gentle hum of supervision lies another economy of virtue, one stitched into fabric, painted onto faces, and sold in glass bottles labelled beauty. The polite world of Victorian beauty glittered under candlelight, but the glow came with a cost. Elegance had a price, and not just in coins. The skin shimmered, the cheeks glowed, and the dresses gleamed. Yet beneath that surface perfection hid a slow chemistry of harm. To look alive, you had to risk dying fashionably. The Victorians never saw vanity as trivial. Appearance was a moral statement. To look composed was to prove your virtue, your breeding, your worthiness of respect. A woman's face was expected to be serene and colourless, as if untouched by sunlight or effort. But nature rarely provided that ideal, so industry stepped in. Cosmetics promised purity and quietly delivered poison. Green was the fashionable colour of the century. Wallpaper, gowns, ribbons, artificial flowers, all glowed with a vivid, impossible brightness, thanks to a pigment made from arsenic. It looked beautiful, like sunlight captured in fabric, but it killed slowly. The dye leached into skin, flaked into the air, and turned seamstresses' hands a faint, sickly yellow. Women wore the colour of envy, and the colour envied their survival. Rouge and powder followed the same logic. Face powder contained lead, which smoothed the skin by quietly numbing it. Rouge was tinted with mercury, which brought a temporary bloom to pale cheeks before it began to darken the gums and tremble the hands. Doctors warned of cosmetic paralysis, but society preferred perfection over practicality. The market agreed. Beauty, like everything else, was a form of consumption. Factories churned out these deadly delights with industrial pride. Young women, most barely 16, mix powders and paints in unventilated rooms. They work surrounded by dust that glittered faintly as it poisoned them. A single corset might require 40 feet of fabric and dozens of metal stays polished by hand until their fingers bled. By the time those garments reached the drawing rooms of Mayfair, they had passed through a quiet underworld of invisible labour, workers who made beauty possible and never tasted its rewards. The middle class adored this new abundance. Magazines praised the moral cleanliness of fine dress. They claimed good taste was proof of inner virtue, as though silk could absolve sin. Shopping itself became a moral duty. Women were encouraged to spend wisely but constantly, to keep the domestic economy spinning. To appear fashionable was patriotic. You were supporting industry while signalling virtue. Commerce disguised as conscience. Department stores rose like temples of improvement. Their displays gleamed with mirrors and gaslight, promising transformation for every budget. For a few coins, one could buy decency. For a few more, transcendence. Salesgirls demonstrated perfumes and powders, repeating slogans that bordered on sermons. Purity in every bottle. Refinement you can wear. The marketplace began to sound like a chapel. There's a certain dark humour in the numbers, not mathematical ones, but social ones. A proper lady might spend 2 hours dressing for dinner, but only 15 minutes eating it. Meals, like morals, were meant to be small. The corset ensured both. Fashion wasn't only an aesthetic, it was an economy of control. The narrower your waist, the higher your social worth. Manufacturers sold measuring tapes marked not in inches, but in aspiration. Still, people noticed the contradictions. Satirical pamphlets mocked arsenic beauties, who glowed faintly green in candlelight. Caricatures showed women powdered to the brink of disappearance. One cartoon caption read, "She died doing her duty, looking respectable." Yet the laughter changed nothing. Even when the dangers were known, few could abandon the rituals. Etiquette demanded perfection, and imperfection was more dangerous than poison. Behind closed doors, some women began to question the system. Writers like Elizabeth Blackwell and Amelia Bloomer spoke about health reform, rational dress and chemical safety. They were dismissed as unfeminine, as though intelligence itself were a cosmetic flaw. But their ideas spread quietly, folded into letters, whispered through sewing circles. A few small factories experimented with safer dyes, though profits rarely survived the experiment. The strange thing about the Victorian conscience was how sincerely it believed that suffering could be beautiful. A pale face meant purity, a fainting body meant refinement. The pain of corsets, the rash from powder, the headaches from perfume, these were accepted as signs of delicacy. Discomfort became a social currency. You weren't just enduring hardship, you were performing it for applause. The scent of respectability, meanwhile, was almost literal. Middle-class homes smelled of starch, polish, and faint floral soaps, clean enough to hide the coal smoke outside. But in factory districts, the air carried another perfume: metal, dye, and chemical dust. The same society that praised purity relied on invisible hands to make it possible. Morality, it seemed, was a fragrance affordable only to those who didn't have to make it. If you picture the scene clearly, you can almost hear the symphony of it. Scissors snipping, fabrics rustling, machines clattering. A forewoman calls out measurements. A girl coughs softly into her sleeve. Somewhere across town, a wealthy lady admires her reflection in a mirror framed with gold leaf, unaware that the shimmer in her wallpaper and the blush on her face came from the same slow poison. And perhaps the most haunting irony is this: the Victorians truly thought they were improving the world. Industrial progress promised cleanliness, refinement, and order. Factories were temples of modernity. Products were evidence of civilization's ascent. No one wanted to see that progress and poison had become the same word whispered through different rooms. Even now the trade continues. Safer ingredients, same philosophy. We buy lotions promising confidence, clothes promising power, lifestyles promising worth. The packaging has changed, but the moral arithmetic remains. Looking respectable still costs something. Only the currency has shifted from pigment and pain to time and attention. As the century wore on, the danger of beauty began to blur into another ritual altogether: the elaborate performance of grief. Black fabric replaced green arsenic gowns, and sorrow itself became the new luxury. Where vanity once demanded powder, mourning demanded crepe. And so, the economy of virtue adjusted, as it always did, to whatever emotion could be sold next. The year is 1875. The curtains are drawn, the mirrors covered, and the clock in the hallway has been stopped at the hour of death. In the parlour, everything wears black. The drapes, the furniture, even the air. Somewhere in that dimness you sit perfectly still. You're not only mourning, you're performing it. In Victorian Britain, grief came with instructions. There were schedules for sorrow, fabrics for sadness, and a social expectation that emotion must be dressed correctly. When someone died, the living inherited a second burden. the responsibility to look properly devastated. The mourning process was a masterpiece of organisation. Etiquette manuals specified precise timelines for every relationship. A widow mourned her husband for 2 full years, spending the first in total black and the second in muted grey. A child mourned a parent for 6 months, siblings for 3, cousins for 6 weeks. A descending scale of sorrow, measured not in tears but in fabric. Black crepe was the official uniform of despair. It was heavy, scratchy and absorbent, collecting dust and soot like a visual echo of grief. It could not be washed, because cleanliness would suggest recovery. The longer you wore it, the more your sorrow appeared sincere. The sound of crepe brushing against itself became the music of mourning, a dry, whispering rhythm that followed you through every doorway. Even the accessories obeyed protocol. Jewellery was made from jet, a fossilised coal polished until it gleamed like tears. Locks of hair from the deceased were woven into brooches, rings or bracelets, a literal strand of memory worn against the pulse. Stationery changed colour too, letters sent on grey paper with black borders, envelopes sealed with wax darker than night. To send a note on white paper before your mourning period ended was nearly scandalous. The emotional equivalent of laughter at a funeral. The house itself became a stage for solemnity. Clocks were stopped to symbolise that time no longer mattered. Mirrors were covered to prevent the spirit of the dead from being trapped inside. Neighbours called not to console but to inspect, quietly judging whether the household's grief met community standards. A widow who reappeared in society too soon risked being called heartless. One who stayed in seclusion too long was accused of melodrama. It was, as one newspaper put it, the art of mourning correctly. Funeral customs were similarly theatrical. Hearses gleamed with polished black horses. Mourners walked in measured steps, eyes lowered, expressions suitably tragic. Professional mourners were sometimes hired to cry on behalf of the shy. The spectacle turned loss into an aesthetic, sorrow into choreography. And yet within this formality lay strange comfort. The rituals gave structure to chaos, a script for those who didn't know what to do with their hands or hearts. To wear black was to tell the world, "Do not expect me to be normal." For women, especially widows, mourning offered a rare kind of freedom, an excuse to withdraw from social obligations, to exist quietly without apology. The crepe, though suffocating, was also protective. Still, the business of grief thrived. Mourning warehouses sold everything from veils to stationery to coffin decorations. Tailors advertised express sorrow fittings. Newspapers carried obituaries alongside fashion reports, sometimes on the same page. Half mourning, a term for the gradual return to colour, spawned its own seasonal line of lilac and grey dresses. Grief was expensive and everyone knew it. To mourn properly was to prove both affection and income. The contradictions were everywhere. A widow could lose her fortune when her husband died, but still be expected to maintain appearances. Servants dressed in black as well, though their wages rarely covered the cost. Charity organisations collected worn mourning clothes for the poor, who were then scolded for looking too gloomy. Even sadness, it seemed, had a dress code for every class. Writers noticed the absurdity. Satirical essays mocked the obsession with appearances, one claiming that a lady may love her husband less if she mourns him in silk rather than crepe. But satire could not undo the comfort people found in order. In a century obsessed with control, mourning was a way to make death manageable, to wrap chaos in cloth and rules. There was, however, a quiet rebellion beneath all that black. Some women used mourning as a form of pause, a socially acceptable retreat from the endless demands of politeness. They could stop hosting, stop performing, stop smiling. For the first time, solitude wasn't suspicious. The world expected silence, and they found peace in it. Mourning became less about loss and more about recovery, a kind of emotional quarantine. You can almost imagine the soundscape, the ticking of a clock no longer wound, the muffled steps on carpet, the slow crackle of fire behind heavy drapes. The whole house breathed differently, as though holding its breath in respect. In that quiet, thoughts gathered about mortality, about freedom, about how strange it felt to be visible only through absence. When the mourning period finally ended, women often described it as shedding a skin. To wear colour again felt like stepping into sunlight after years underground. But returning to the living world came with its own dangers. People expected transformation. A widow in lavender was fair game for matchmaking. Grief, it turned out, was safer than joy. Today, traces of that choreography linger. We still perform loss in curated ways. Online tributes, framed photographs, playlists of memory. We still measure mourning in public gestures, how long the profile picture stays dark, how many words are written beneath the announcement. The costumes have changed, but the longing for structure remains. The Victorians, for all their eccentricity, understood something we often forget, that grief needs texture. It needs something to hold, fabric, ritual, rhythm, or it drifts into formless pain. They turned sorrow into art so that they could survive it. So when you picture that darkened parlour, the hush, the veils, the slow pulse of the clock, remember that beneath all that black was a strange kind of mercy. It gave people a way to keep living in a world that kept ending. As the curtains slowly reopen and daylight creeps across the room, the story shifts once more. Outside, society resumes its rhythm, guarded by new rules. Rules about who may touch, and when, and under what supervision. The next lesson, as it happens, is about how even affection required an audience. You're in a ballroom again. The chandeliers glow, violins hum softly, and the air shimmers with perfume and sweat disguised as refinement. Men stand in rows, women sit in clusters, and between them flows the most carefully monitored substance in the Victorian world: physical contact. Touch was dangerous, but it was also currency. Every fingertip was collateral. In a society obsessed with reputation, nothing was more fragile than skin. Touch implied intention. It could ruin, redeem, or redefine. To protect against that risk, the Victorians invented a profession: the chaperone. Her job was simple: to make sure nothing interesting happened. She was usually a relative, sometimes a hired guardian, occasionally a professional. She wore experience like armour and suspicion like perfume. Her eyes were everywhere, watching hands, counting dance steps, interpreting every glance for signs of impropriety. If politeness was a religion, the chaperone was its priest, guarding the altar of restraint. For unmarried women, her presence was as inescapable as air. You didn't visit a park, attend a concert, or stroll by the seaside without one. Even letters between lovers passed through her scrutiny. She was the firewall of virtue, standing politely between curiosity and consequence. Yet this wasn't only about protection. It was also economics, the economy of touch. A woman's social value depended on scarcity. The less accessible she was, the more she was admired. The chaperone managed that scarcity like a banker managing gold. Every dance, every handshake, every moment of privacy had to be rationed, invested, or denied. Desire was safest when it could be observed. Balls were the perfect theatre for this transaction. Dancing allowed brief, sanctioned contact. A gloved hand, a palm against silk, a shoulder nearly brushing another's. These were not accidents. They were rehearsed negotiations. Every step carried subtext. I am interested, but still moral. I can approach, but not belong. Dance instructors became experts in geometry, teaching partners how to appear intimate without consequence. The gloves, of course, were essential. They were the thin boundary between decency and scandal. Etiquette required that both dancers wear them at all times, ensuring no unmediated skin met another. In a way, gloves were the Victorian version of encryption, allowing information to pass without evidence. When the waltz appeared, it was sustery scandalous in its close embrace. Moral panic erupted. Critics declared it a foreign indecency, a revolution of limbs. Preachers warned that such proximity would invite ruin. But the waltz survived, partly because its rhythm matched the heartbeat. Even under supervision, the human need for closeness found its rhythm. Not every encounter was elegant. Sometimes a dance went slightly wrong. A hand lingered too long. A spin moved too near the edge of propriety. The chaperone would cough gently, a small thunderclap of warning. The sound meant careful, you're visible. It was astonishing how much authority could hide inside one polite throat clearing. The job wasn't without irony. Chaperones themselves were often widowed or unmarried, living proof of what too much propriety could achieve. They enforced rules that had once confined them, guarding young women against the very freedom they'd never tasted. Still, many took pride in the work. They saw themselves as protectors, and in a world where scandal could end a woman's life as surely as illness, they weren't wrong. But, as always, people learned to adapt. Young couples discovered creative ways to outwit supervision. Garden paths became negotiation corridors. Dropped fans or lost ribbons served as excuses for brief solitude. Letters were slipped between book pages. Whispers passed through dance partners. Even under surveillance, affection persisted. Proof that desire is the most resourceful outlaw in history. There was a certain comedy to the whole arrangement. Imagine an entire generation trained to flirt under observation. Men spoke in riddles, women replied in metaphors, and everyone pretended not to notice what was obviously happening. The chaperone smiled, aware of everything, pretending ignorance as part of the job. The ballroom became a masquerade of sincerity. Beyond the parties, the logic of the chaperone extended into daily life. Families hired companions for daughters, escorts for widows, and governesses for travel. A woman alone was never just a woman. She was a question waiting to be answered. Respectability was a group project. Even in death, the rules applied. Widows could not remarry before a decent interval, lest grief appear insincere. Time itself was chaperoned. There's something oddly tender about the image, a society so afraid of chaos that it built safety out of supervision. But the cost was high. The constant presence of witnesses turned affection into performance. Intimacy became an audience sport. No gesture was truly private, which is perhaps why so much meaning was hidden in small, almost invisible actions. A brush of fabric, a shared laugh, a letter that smelled faintly of courage. And though the chaperone is gone, her spirit lingers. The algorithms that track our messages, the etiquette of online replies, the constant awareness of being observed. These are her descendants. We still live under the soft gaze of supervision, performing connection while being measured for appropriateness. The glove has turned digital, but the distance remains. Yet, like those dancers in the candlelit ballroom, we still find ways to touch the world, briefly, carefully, and always with a trace of rebellion. Because even the most disciplined generation could never completely silence the simple miracle of contact. As the music fades and the chaperone gathers her shawl, the crowd disperses into night. But the discipline doesn't end at the ballroom door. Outside, the same rules continue, not about love this time, but about posture, bearing, and how to hold the body itself as evidence of virtue. The next lesson is about control made visible, the art of standing straight in a crooked world. You wake before dawn to a pale winter light slipping through lace curtains. The house is quiet except for the slow tick of the clock and the faint creak of a floorboard under your slipper. In the corner stands your reflection, not in the mirror, but in a polished brass frame fitted with straps and rods. The corset waits. The spine straightener leans beside it like a patient instrument. Mourning for a Victorian woman began not with freedom but with alignment. To live in polite society was to be a sculpture in motion. The body was both advertisement and proof. Posture measured character. Composure meant virtue. The perfect back wasn't just elegant, it was moral. A straight spine, said one etiquette guide, reveals a straight mind. They meant it literally. Children were corrected at the dining table for slouching, as if a curved shoulder hinted at rebellion. Parents invested in posture chairs with rods that pressed between the shoulder blades, teaching obedience through discomfort. Deportment schools flourished. Young girls spent hours balancing books on their heads, practicing the sacred geometry of grace. They learned to glide across a room as though blessed by frictionless air. Every movement was deliberate, every gesture rehearsed. Teachers corrected posture with rulers, guiding elbows into the perfect angle of gentility. It was training for a life spent being looked at, a lifetime of rehearsed composure. The apparatus of refinement was ingenious and mildly cruel. There were steel braces to prevent stooping, bust improvers to adjust the chest, and devices that buzzed softly when you slouched. The body became an instrument of etiquette, constantly tuned for public approval. Muscles ached quietly beneath layers of silk, but pain, as always, was the tax of belonging. Even walking was regulated. Manuals instructed women to keep the chin slightly lowered, the head centered, the gaze calm but never vacant. The arms were to move minimally. A lady should appear guided by unseen strings. To watch a Victorian woman move was to witness grace manufactured by practice. Behind that, grace was muscle memory built from centuries of correction. Men had their own disciplines. Military drills and sports taught posture as patriotism. A gentleman's stance was meant to suggest command, never comfort. But for women, posture wasn't about authority. It was about acceptability. Straightness meant survival. Every curtsy, every bow, every carefully measured step served as proof that you understood the rules and could bear them with poise. The irony was that medical science often agreed. Doctors warned that habitual drooping could cause moral and physical decay. Health and virtue merged into a single diagram. Breathing correctly, sitting correctly, even sleeping correctly, all promise longevity and grace. You could be forgiven for thinking that the human soul was located somewhere between the collarbones. Behind the instruction, though, there was a deeper purpose. Control disguised as improvement. A perfectly trained body didn't just move correctly, it behaved correctly. Posture was the first lesson in self-policing, the quiet internalization of the gaze. You didn't need anyone to remind you to be proper, your spine did it for you. Imagine the tension of that existence, the constant awareness of your body as an object in public space. You couldn't slouch, couldn't yawn, couldn't stretch without implication. Relaxation itself became suspect. To lean too casually was to risk appearing idle. To sit too comfortably was to invite scandal. Even rest had to look respectable. The discipline began young. Little girls practiced standing still for long stretches, their hands folded over pinafores. If they wiggled, they were corrected gently. A lady must never fidget. The phrase was less advice than prophecy. Fidgeting meant life leaking through the surface, and life was messy. Better to stay contained, to become stillness personified. Some women embraced it. They found pride in poise, elegance in endurance. A perfectly balanced walk became a quiet triumph. A small rebellion performed flawlessly. Grace was power in disguise, the ability to turn obedience into art. When your choices are limited, mastery of movement becomes its own kind of freedom. Others resisted, quietly or otherwise. Reformers mocked deportment schools as gymnasiums of repression. They argued that bodies were meant to move, breathe, and sweat. A few daring women took up exercise, scandalizing society by lifting dumbbells or riding bicycles. Newspapers called them the unfeminine few, but these small acts of rebellion reshaped the century. The bicycle, after all, gave women the ability to travel alone, the first true unchaperoned motion. The beauty industry soon adapted, as it always did. Posture correctors turned fashionable, marketed as health aids. Grace without effort, one advertisement promised, conveniently omitting the bruises that effort required. The more society changed, the more it found new ways to sell discipline as luxury. Picture now a parlour filled with women, practising deportment, a slow ballet of upright backs and measured smiles. The teacher walks among them, adjusting shoulders, murmuring compliments, her voice low and kind but never warm. Outside, the city clatters with carriages and factory whistles, but inside, time has stopped. The room smells faintly of starch and lavender. No one breathes deeply. No one slouches. The world, for a moment, seems perfectly controlled, and yet you can sense what happens next. The small rebellion of fatigue, the inevitable exhale. The body remembers that it is human. Shoulders drop, the back loosens, air floods the lungs. The perfect shape collapses into comfort, and comfort into truth. It's the same relief that arrives when a performer steps off stage, no longer required to impersonate elegance. In the end, the lesson of posture wasn't about standing tall. It was about endurance. To hold yourself upright in a crooked world is exhausting work. The Victorians turned that exhaustion into art. They believed that discipline built character, and perhaps it did. But it also built a quiet ache that never entirely faded. And when that ache grew too heavy, there was always a larger dream to hide behind, the dream of empire, of bringing refinement to the rest of the world. The same posture that straightened the body would soon be used to straighten nations. From the schoolroom to the colonies, the Victorian spine was ready to stand over everything. Picture a steamship leaving the London docks, its deck crowded with trunks stamped made in Britain. Inside those trunks lie more than goods. They hold an entire philosophy. Porcelain tea sets, lace gloves, silver spoons, etiquette manuals bound in green leather. The cargo isn't just merchandise, it's morality in transit. The Victorians weren't content to rule the seas, they wanted to rule behaviour itself. By the mid-19th century, etiquette had become one of Britain's most successful exports. Missionaries carried it with their sermons, merchants wrapped it around their wares, civil servants enforced it alongside law. Good manners became proof of civilization, a sign that empire was not conquest but charity. To teach someone to sip tea correctly was, in their minds, to rescue them from chaos. The phrase, "the white man's burden," was often quoted in poetry, but it might just as well have been the clean hand's burden. Cleanliness became a metaphor for purity, both spiritual and political. Soap advertisements showed Britannia herself scrubbing the world until it gleamed. The message was simple: wash and become worthy. It was empire reduced to hygiene. Factories in Liverpool and Manchester mass-produced this new gospel. Bars of soap wrapped in paper promised more than cleanliness. They promised civility. A campaign for one brand even claimed its product had brought peace to the Congo, as if bubbles alone could cleanse history. The Victorians believed progress had a scent, part lavender, part denial. Across colonies from India to Africa, British administrators built schools where students learned arithmetic, scripture, and posture, in that order. Children recited grammar exercises by day and etiquette lessons by evening. To sit straight, speak softly, and say please was to graduate into modernity. The idea was not just to educate, but to domesticate. Empire worked best when its subjects believed politeness was progress. Tea drinking became the universal ceremony of submission and aspiration. Colonial households displayed cups and saucers like badges of advancement. To stir tea without noise was to announce oneself as refined. The ritual seemed harmless, almost comforting, but it carried an invisible price. It replaced local customs with imported grace. The empire didn't just take land, it rearranged posture. Missionaries wrote long letters home about the miracle of manners abroad. Even the savages now bow before speaking, one noted proudly. The line reads comic now, but it reveals a deeper truth. Empire turned etiquette into evidence. The British measured civilization by how well others imitated them. Clean hands were not just proof of health, they were proof of control. Back in England, newspapers glorified this civilizing mission. They printed illustrations of native children learning to hold forks and knives. Politicians boasted that Britain's greatest export wasn't machinery or textiles, but decency. The empire imagined itself as a finishing school for the planet, a teacher correcting billions of pupils one curtsy at a time. The irony, of course, was that the mother country remained deeply unequal. The same society that taught politeness abroad left its own factory workers unwashed, uneducated, and unheard. London slums reeked of poverty, while pamphlets praised the moral purity of British refinement. It was an age that could wash its hands without washing its conscience. Still, for many colonised people, Victorian manners became tools of navigation, a way to survive an unbalanced system. Learning English etiquette could open doors otherwise locked. Diplomats, scholars, and writers used it like armour. Mimic the master's grace, and the master might forget you were meant to serve. The empire taught rules, and then watched as those rules were turned against it. There's a strange beauty in that reversal. The language of politeness, imported to control, became the language of resistance. Reformers and independence leaders would later use the same calm, precise English tone to demand freedom. The empire that measured virtue in teaspoons accidentally trained its challengers to speak with authority. Every lecture on table manners was, in the long run, a rehearsal for revolution. Even at home, the illusion of moral superiority began to crack. Reports of atrocities filtered back through those same polite newspapers. The readers who had been told that tea civilized the tropics now saw that tea was paid for with blood and hunger. Still, the public clung to its rituals. Politeness survived scandal better than truth ever could. Imagine the scene. A British dinner table late in the century. Guests discuss empire between mouthfuls of imported curry and sugar, both sweetened by distant suffering. No one mentions it. The silverware gleams, the napkins are spotless, and every motion is practiced serenity. The moral white glove myth has never been stronger. Humour, though, was never far away. Some writers mocked the imperial obsession with cleanliness. "We have scrubbed the world," one quipped, "and lost the soap." Others pointed out that Britain had confused sanitation with salvation. The joke stung, but not enough to stop the trade. Manners once sold to individuals were now sold to nations. By the turn of the 20th century, the Victorian project of refinement had become self-parody. Colonies sent back their own versions of British civility, sometimes exaggerated, sometimes ironic. A kind of global mimicry began, everyone learning to pour tea with composure, everyone privately rolling their eyes. The empire of clean hands had spread everywhere, even to those who knew it was absurd. Today, the remnants survive in smaller gestures: corporate etiquette, international protocol, the polite email written in the shadow of power. The belief that correctness equals goodness still lingers like the faint smell of soap in an empty room. We are, in many ways, still rinsing ourselves in the idea that being proper makes us pure. But if you listen beneath the hum of history, there's a quieter sound. The ripple of resistance, the laughter behind the mask of politeness. The people who learned those rules learned too how to break them elegantly. The empire's finest export turned out not to be manners, but irony. As the sun sets over that polished dinner table, the reflection of candlelight trembles on the silverware. Somewhere beyond the window, the colonies stir, voices rising in new rhythms. The lesson of clean hands has been rewritten, the soap rinsed away by time. what remains is the faint shimmer of awareness that civility, however noble it looks, can still hide the dirt it refuses to name. And from here, the story begins to turn inward again, away from empire and back to the body, to the quiet discipline of survival itself, to the rituals of endurance that people carried long after the century of manners had ended. It begins, as most rebellions do, with good manners. Picture a dinner table shining with crystal and silver. The host drones on about politics. The women smile politely, the candles flicker, and somewhere between the soup and the sermon, one guest begins her quiet revolution. She nods, agrees, and then quotes a line of scripture. One that, if you listen closely, contradicts him entirely. The table pauses. The host blinks. She smiles again, as if nothing happened. Everyone resumes eating. No one can accuse her of being rude, but the air has shifted. That was how rebellion worked here, softly, under the hum of respectability. Victorian women were rarely invited to fight rules directly, so they learned to use them as camouflage. The same etiquette that restricted them became a tool, a kind of social judo, where politeness turned into power. A fainting spell at the right moment could stop a marriage negotiation. A smile could hide strategy. A compliment could deliver critique. Each gesture was an act of choreography, a rebellion written in cursive. One letter from the time, written by an unmarried woman to a friend, reads like a manual of survival. Never disagree, she advises, but ask questions until the foolish believe they have taught you something. It's hard not to admire the precision. Compliance became an art form, obedience so perfect it turned itself inside out. The drawing room, that sanctuary of quiet conversation, doubled as a workshop for resistance. Women met under the guise of moral improvement societies or embroidery circles. They discussed literature, philosophy, and sometimes politics, all carefully disguised as domestic talk. We were reading aloud from Mrs. Browning, one attendee later wrote, and somehow found ourselves discussing freedom. The phrase "somehow found ourselves" was the century's politest way of saying we knew exactly what we were doing. Etiquette allowed for plausible deniability. When accused of being too opinionated, women could retreat behind softness. "Oh, I merely asked a question," they'd say, or "it was only a line from a poem." Their power lay in the gap between meaning and appearance. Even silence could be eloquent. A pause at the right time spoke louder than argument. Fainting, too, was repurposed from fragility into strategy. The strategic swoon, once a symbol of delicacy, became a convenient exit from unwanted situations. When discussions grew unbearable, when proposals loomed, or when a man mistook politeness for permission, a woman could simply let gravity do the talking. No need to argue, just faint. The body became the protest, a refusal delivered with elegance. Writers joined the quiet insurrection. Some women published under male pseudonyms, others under initials, turning anonymity into armour. A few went further, using their reputations for gentility to smuggle dangerous ideas into respectable formats. Cookbooks with moral essays tucked between recipes, household guides that contained hidden manifestos on education and equality. Every bookshelf became a small Trojan horse, covered in lace. Even conversation itself became a weapon. The art of flattery could steer decisions. A woman might convince her husband to fund a local school by praising his generosity. Another might secure her daughter's freedom to study by describing it as a modern form of household management. The trick was to package rebellion as duty. If virtue was a language, women learned to speak it fluently and to twist its grammar when needed. There was humour in it too, the dry kind, sharpened by survival. A well-timed curtsy, one diarist wrote, can achieve what argument cannot. Another observed, "We obeyed every rule until the rules grew dizzy." The laughter was quiet, but it was laughter nonetheless, the sound of endurance pretending to be grace. Not all defiance wore a smile. Some women founded reading clubs disguised as charity groups. They met to sew for the poor, then read essays on social reform once the door was closed. In certain towns, even the choice of a hymn could be a statement. The line, "Make us free men, we pray thee, O Lord," was sung with deliberate slowness, eyes lifted just high enough to make the point. This was rebellion written in lowercase, invisible, persistent, and undefeated. The same women who were told to whisper learned to speak in codes so subtle that even history almost missed them. Their resistance wasn't loud because it couldn't be, but it was effective. Politeness protected them long enough to plant ideas that would outlive every rulebook. And of course, resistance always adapts. In the modern world, the same strategy survives, now dressed in office clothes and polite emails. "Thank you for your feedback" has replaced "Indeed, sir, you may be right," but the tone is identical. Corporate rebellion thrives on the same calm deflection. The smile that hides refusal, the measured agreement that derails control. Even in the 21st century, the art of strategic compliance remains undefeated. The Victorians mastered it because they had no choice. They discovered that control collapses when it can't detect defiance. The moment rebellion looks like obedience, it becomes unstoppable. That is why etiquette, for all its absurdity, became the training ground for revolution. Behind every curtsy was a calculation. Behind every demure reply, a mind rewriting the rules in real time. If you could see the century from above, 1,000 tea tables, 1,000 drawing rooms, all glittering under candlelight, you'd notice something. Every so often, one woman looks up just for a second and meets another's eyes across the room. They don't speak. They don't need to. The understanding passes silently. We know. And then they return to their embroidery, to their polite smiles, to the grand performance of submission that is already becoming satire. It's easy to mistake gentleness for weakness. The Victorians knew better. They proved that obedience, handled correctly, could be subversive. Every rule followed perfectly became a mirror, reflecting the absurdity of the rule itself. They obeyed until obedience looked ridiculous, and then politely they stopped. As the candles burn lower and the sound of conversation fades into the ticking of a clock, imagine those quiet rebels, gathering their shawls, their notebooks, their secret letters. They step into the night, the air cool against their faces, their breath slow and measured, not in submission, but in triumph. They have spoken in the only language allowed, and somehow the message has travelled. And as we follow that quiet breeze of defiance, we find that it carries the scent of new fabric, lighter, freer, designed not for display but for movement. The next act of rebellion won't be whispered, it will be worn. It begins, not with a shout, but with a seam rip. The sound is small, a thread loosening, a bit of fabric sighing. But in Victorian society, it was enough to cause a scandal. Somewhere in a modest parlour in upstate New York, a woman named Amelia Bloomer decides she has had enough of nearly drowning in her own skirt. She reaches for a new idea: trousers. At first glance, it seems harmless. A practical garment, inspired by Turkish pantaloons, light and airy, worn beneath a shorter skirt. But the moment she steps outside, the world gasps. Newspapers call it the end of womanhood as we know it. Men stare, women whisper, children point. The Bloomer costume has arrived, and modesty will never sleep comfortably again. The dress reform movement looked mild on paper. Rational clothing, improved health, the freedom to walk without tripping. But to the Victorian mind, it was heresy. Clothing was not just decoration, it was destiny. Skirts signified submission, corsets symbolised control. To change the shape of what you wore was to question the shape of society itself, and that, of course, could not stand. Amelia Bloomer was not alone. Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Elizabeth Blackwell joined her, testing garments that allowed breathing, climbing stairs, even existing without supervision. They argued that fabric was political, that comfort was not sin. Newspapers mocked them as unfeminine. preachers warned that trousers would lead directly to moral collapse. One editor claimed that if women wore pants, men might soon be forced to knit. Civilization apparently would unravel one stitch at a time. The women smiled and walked on, quite literally. For the first time in public memory, women could walk freely. Long strides instead of dainty glides, bodies moving with rhythm instead of restraint. It was shocking to see fabric follow anatomy rather than hide it. In the eyes of the polite world, it was indecent simply because it looked alive. The backlash was ferocious. Strangers shouted in the streets, calling them monsters in petticoats. Satirical cartoons showed women with exaggerated legs and horrified expressions. One pamphlet described the outfit as an abomination combining the confusion of gender with the arrogance of freedom. The press turned rebellion into spectacle, yet every insult spread the image further. Mockery became advertisement. There was humour in it too. A witness recalled a group of men heckling Amelia Bloomer as she crossed a bridge. She stopped, smiled, and said, "Gentlemen, please, one at a time." The heckling ceased. She kept walking. That was the essence of the movement. Unhurried, amused, unstoppable. The rational dress advocates organised meetings and wrote essays framing clothing as a question of health. Corsets crushed ribs. Skirts caught fire and spread disease. Reformers didn't ask for glamour, only for lungs. It was a modest request, but it carried the weight of a revolution. The right to breathe, to walk, to exist in your own body without apology. That was the true rebellion. In Britain, the movement found allies among artists and thinkers, members of the aesthetic movement, tired of industrial stiffness, championed flowing gowns and natural fabrics. They preferred silk that bent rather than boards that pinched. Their colours were muted, their humour sharp. "We seek beauty," one said, "not suffocation." Dress reform became the quiet twin of social reform, aesthetic rebellion disguised as taste. But progress, as always, moves slower than fabric. The Bloomer costume eventually faded from fashion, replaced by compromise. Slightly looser skirts, softer corsets, better breathing room. It wasn't a revolution that stormed barricades. It was a revolution that strolled politely down the street, refused to trip, and didn't apologise for it. Still, the idea refused to die. Decades later, the bicycle arrived, and with it, a second wave of trousered freedom. Women on bicycles terrified moralists. One writer predicted that the end of the skirt will be the end of civilization. Another fretted that women might start developing calves. The irony, of course, was that bicycles were marketed as health devices, the same justification the Victorians had once used to lace women tightly. Now, motion itself became morality. And then there were the pockets, small rebellions sewn into fabric. Before dress reform, women's clothing was famously pocketless, forcing them to carry delicate purses that could hold little but patience. Reformers demanded functional space. A woman, one pamphlet argued, should have as many pockets as she has thoughts. The joke spread quickly. So did the fear. Society wasn't ready for women with storage. Power, after all, begins with having somewhere to put things. The pocket became a metaphor for agency, for autonomy, for the simple ability to hold your own possessions without permission. To wear trousers with pockets was to admit you had intentions, perhaps even plans. That, more than any cut of cloth, made it revolutionary. Dress reform also inspired changes in men's fashion. As women simplified, men elaborated. Waistcoats, watch chains, polished shoes. Refinement became armour on both sides, each gender dressing for battle in the war of appearances. But while men's clothing stayed stable for a century, women's kept evolving, quietly refusing to settle. Freedom once stitched can't easily be hemmed again. You can almost hear the sound of it, the whisper of fabric against cobblestones, the slow rhythm of footsteps unbound by corsets. It's not loud enough to frighten horses, but it's steady enough to echo. The rebellion is walking home, tired but upright, carrying its dignity in the very folds of its new design. Even now that spirit survives, The modern blazer, the jumpsuit, the sneaker, all descendants of those scandalous bloomers. Every time someone says, "I want to be comfortable," they're repeating the same heresy. Comfort was once considered dangerous because it made people difficult to control, and it still is. So when you see old photographs of women in their experimental trousers, proud, nervous, absurd, magnificent, remember that they weren't trying to look radical. They were simply trying to breathe. The scandal lay not in what they wore, but in what they refused to carry: permission. And as the century turns, the rebellion shifts again. The body, newly freed, finds itself entangled with machines, wires, keys, and electric signals that promise connection but bring new rules. The next revolution won't be in fabric, it will hum through metal. It begins with a spark, a tiny pulse of electricity racing down a wire, carrying words faster than any carriage or ship could travel. The Victorians called it progress. The rest of the world called it noise. The telegraph arrived like a polite miracle. For the first time in history, distance no longer meant silence. A thought in London could reach New York before the tea went cold. The wonder was intoxicating. The confusion was immediate. No one knew how to behave. The first etiquette manuals for telegraph use appeared within a year. Do not send trivial messages, they advised. Do not use the wire for gossip. Within a week, everyone was doing exactly that. Lovers sent coded messages under the guise of business. Parents checked on their children. Politicians discovered the joy of miscommunication at unprecedented speed. Morse code, dots and dashes, was humanity's first form of texting. It was formal, expensive, and impossible to proofread. One misplaced dot could transform safe arrival into save arrival, prompting unnecessary hysteria at both ends. A single extra dash might destroy a friendship. The Victorians, already anxious about tone, now had to worry about timing. How soon should one reply to a telegram? Was it rude to answer immediately? Was a delayed response a sign of dignity or disdain? For the first time, waiting itself became etiquette. The operators, usually young women with precise hands and endless patience, became gatekeepers of emotion. They carried love notes, business deals, and bad news through invisible lines. Every message passed through their ears before reaching its destination. It was intimacy with witnesses. The telegraph office, filled with the constant tap-tap-tap of conversation, became a new kind of ballroom, one where everyone was talking and no one was touching. It didn't take long for anxiety to evolve. The Victorians had already mastered the art of social panic. The telegraph simply gave it voltage. Newspapers complained of telegraphic agitation. People felt pressure to be constantly reachable, a new kind of exhaustion disguised as efficiency. One columnist wrote, "I no longer wait for letters, I wait for interruptions." That sentence could easily belong to the 21st century. Humour found its way into the chaos. Stories spread of overzealous telegraph users. A woman allegedly sent a telegram to her husband across town that read, "Why have you not written?" He replied, "Because I am reading this." Another man, eager to seem modern, began every message with "stop, stop, stop," mistakenly believing it meant hello. The first double text, in other words, was written in Morse code. Soon came the telephone, and with it an entirely new set of problems. Speaking through wires felt unnatural. Voices echoed, timing lagged, and no one knew how to begin or end a call politely. Hello was considered too casual at first. The recommended greeting, invented by Alexander Graham Bell himself, was "Ahoy!" The world refused. Within a decade, hello became the universal opening line, a verbal curtsy to modernity. But the telephone didn't just connect people, it exposed them. The intimacy of hearing someone's breath, their hesitation, their pauses, it was overwhelming. One etiquette writer called it a dangerous closeness without proximity. Families debated where to place the household telephone. The hallway was ideal because it ensured that every conversation remained public. Privacy, as always, required supervision. Telephone operators replaced the chaperones of old. Every call passed through them first. "Number, please," they'd say, listening long enough to know more than they ever admitted. They heard confessions, quarrels, and declarations of love, all delivered in the polite tones of people pretending they weren't being overheard. The voice, that fragile new instrument, became the latest sight of manners. It's easy to forget how radical the telephone was, a machine that turned sound into electricity and back again. To the Victorians, it bordered on witchcraft. Some refused to use it, claiming it stole the soul through the ear. Others grew addicted. There were warnings about telephonic overstimulation, the 19th century ancestor of doom scrolling. One doctor suggested limiting calls to 10 minutes to avoid nervous collapse. The advice once again went unheeded. As communication sped up, language began to shrink. Telegraphic style became the new fashion, short, clipped, efficient. Sentences lost their ornament, emotions lost their preamble. It was the birth of what we now call concise writing. A telegram didn't allow for flowery apologies or long explanations. It forced people to say what they meant, or, more often, to hide meaning inside the smallest possible words. And so, the Victorian world that once worshipped eloquence discovered brevity. The very society that wrote novels the size of bricks now fell in love with messages under 10 words. Civilization had found a way to be both verbose and speechless. But technology always carries a mirror. Every new device promised connection and delivered a new flavour of loneliness. The telegraph shrank distance but not misunderstanding. The telephone allowed conversation but eliminated pauses, those sacred spaces where thought used to live. The more people talked, the less they listened. For every word transmitted, a little silence was lost. Still, progress hummed on. The clicking of telegraph keys gave way to the trill of telephones. Offices became orchestras of mechanical rhythm, every ring and tap a note in the symphony of modern life. It was beautiful in its own way, a world discovering how to speak to itself across oceans, unsure whether it liked the sound. If you listen closely now, you can still hear it. The ghost of that tapping, faint as raindrops on glass. It's the sound of messages crossing time, one era whispering into another, asking the same question every new technology asks. Can you hear me? And as the echoes of those first electrical voices fade, another hum rises. Softer, digital, invisible. The world of polished manners has moved online, but the questions remain identical. How much should we reveal? How quickly should we respond? How polite must we be when we're already exhausted? The Victorians never solved it, and neither have we. We are still learning how to speak through our machines without losing our humanity. We are still trying to sound alive through the static. You open your phone and catch your reflection in the dark screen before it lights up. For a second, it feels like looking into history itself, a faint silhouette framed by glass and glow, adjusting posture without realizing it. Somewhere, a Victorian lady would recognize that gesture instantly. The technology has changed, but the instinct hasn't. You are still dressing for the gaze. The corset, for example, is alive and well. It no longer laces up the spine or reshapes ribs, but it exists in softer forms. The filter, the feed, the performance of perfection. Every photograph straightens a digital back, cinches a virtual waist, brightens the skin. The stays are invisible now, but the pressure remains. The Victorian woman fainted under whalebone. The modern one scrolls under algorithms. Both learn to breathe in limited space. Etiquette survived too. It just migrated. The manuals have become tutorials. The lectures turned into comment sections. Be authentic, they say, but not too much. Be kind, they say, but never unfiltered. The rules of tone and posture still apply, only the vocabulary has updated. The chaperone has been replaced by the audience. Where once a matron watched from across the parlour, Now 1,000 anonymous observers hover behind the glass. There is a strange comfort in this continuity. The Victorians would have understood our modern anxieties, the fear of being seen too much or too little, the need to curate a self that appears effortless but never careless. They too lived inside invisible codes. They too measured their worth in how gracefully they endured them. Of course, progress has its illusions. We have fewer corsets, but more expectations. Fewer fainting couches, but more burnout. The technology that promised freedom has given us new rituals of performance. The reply within minutes, the polite emoji, the apology that begins every email. The Victorian letter took days to arrive. The digital message arrives instantly, and yet somehow we are always late. Even our rebellions sound familiar. Dress codes are challenged again, though now they involve sneakers in boardrooms instead of bloomers in parlours. Language evolves, pronouns shift, hierarchies soften, and still the debates sound like echoes from another century. Who defines what is proper, and who benefits from that definition? We think we're inventing these questions. In truth, we're only continuing the conversation. Imagine a Victorian woman standing beside you, peering curiously at your glowing screen. She wouldn't understand the words, but she would recognise the posture, the slightly bent neck, the careful self-presentation, the mixture of curiosity and restraint. She might even smile at the resemblance. "Ah," she'd say. "We too had mirrors that told us how to behave, ours simply hung on walls." There's humour in the persistence of human vanity. Every generation invents new tools to admire itself and new ways to suffer for the privilege. Where Victorians worried about ankles, we worry about pixels. They whispered gossip behind fans, we share it in group chats. They performed virtue in drawing rooms, we perform sincerity in status updates. The technology changes, but the choreography stays the same, and yet something has shifted. The spaces between rules have grown wider. Women write their own manuals now, men are allowed softness without scandal, and individuality has become a quiet kind of rebellion. The very tools once used for surveillance, cameras, platforms, networks, have also become instruments of expression. The fan language has returned, but this time it speaks to millions. Still, progress never arrives without irony. We can broadcast our thoughts to the world, yet still feel unheard. We can decorate our lives with proof of freedom, yet still crave permission. Perhaps the Victorian curse was not confinement itself, but the belief that worth must always be demonstrated. We inherited that belief and simply gave it new fonts, but there is hope in recognition. When you see how much of modern life still wears the corset of courtesy, you begin to notice the tiny cracks, the small pauses where humanity leaks through, the unfiltered laugh, the message sent without editing, the photograph where imperfection looks alive. These moments are the modern equivalent of loosening the laces. Breathing once again becomes the truest form of rebellion. The simple act of not performing for a moment, of existing without audience, is the freedom the Victorians dreamed of and never reached. They wrote essays about modesty while secretly longing for air. We post essays about authenticity while secretly longing for silence. History doesn't repeat. It just changes its wallpaper. Still, it's worth pausing to admire how much has been unlearned. No one needs a chaperone to walk outdoors. No one faints to end a conversation. A woman can write under her own name and wear pockets large enough to hold a future. The progress is quiet but undeniable. What was once rebellion has become routine, which is exactly how freedom should look, and yet, the ghosts of etiquette remain useful. They remind us that control is always man-made, and therefore always reversible. Every code, every rule, every expectation was invented by someone who needed order. It can be reinvented by someone who needs peace. The Victorians taught us that creativity doesn't disappear under pressure. It hides there, waiting. So the next time you scroll through a feed, adjusting your angle, your caption, your tone. Think of them. The women who curtsied strategically, who wrote manifestos between recipes, who turned fainting into refusal. They are still here, in every gesture that bends without breaking, in every quiet reclaiming of space. History never truly leaves. It lingers in gestures, in language, in the choreography of daily life. It survives not as rules, but as reminders of how humans adapt and how rebellion, even when whispered, never really ends. And when the screen dims, when the room falls quiet and you're left only with your breath, you realize what they wanted all along. Not applause, not admiration, just enough space to inhale fully and not be punished for it. History doesn't vanish, it simply changes its dress,